Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. Last week, UK judges ruled that the detention of David Miranda, the partner of a Guardian journalist Glenn Greenwald, was lawful. Miranda was held for 9 hours at Heathrow Airport last August under controversial anti-terrorist legislation Schedule 7. In his possession, he had highly classified intelligence documents passed on by the whistleblower Edward Snowden. The court ruled that the interests of national security outweighed the indirect impact on press freedom. Journalists and civil rights organisations are concerned that this is proof that the UK is now equating journalism to terrorism. And the case once again raises the question of how and where to draw the line between public safety and freedom of expression. Can journalists ever be seen as terrorists? And is some information too sensitive ever to be released into the public domain? Well, here to discuss this with me in the studio are Omar Farouk, a barrister at Strand Chambers, Bill Bowring, Professor of Law at Birkbeck University. And on Skype we have Dr. Julian Richards, Co-Director, Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham. On the phone we have Porek Reddy, and we also have Masood Shahjajeh from the Islamic Human Rights Commission. But first, let's take a look at this report by Flaminia Jambalvo.
The 9-hour detention at Heathrow Airport of an ex-Guardian journalist partner was ruled lawful by the High Court on Thursday. In August, Mr. Miranda was held at Heathrow Airport, where he was searched and questioned under Schedule 7 anti-terrorism measures. Miranda was allegedly stopped because of his relationship with journalist Glenn Greenwald. Mr. Greenwald leaked information from source Edward Snowden on the UK's and US's spying activities.
He asked me what was my role in the NSA documents. I explained that I am not involved directly. I don't work with them.
At the High Court, Mr. Miranda claimed his detention under anti-terrorism laws was unlawful and breached his human rights. But judges said it was a proportionate measure in the circumstances and in the interests of national security. The Home Secretary, Theresa May, and the Metropolitan Police welcomed the ruling. A statement released by the Metropolitan Police says, "We are pleased that the court recognized that the Schedule 7 stop was a proportionate measure in the circumstances. Its objective was not only legitimate, but very pressing." However, Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper and Keith Vaz, chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, have said police must explain why terrorism powers were used in this case.
This is the first case that I've heard of where terrorism legislation has been used in this way. But there is no indication that Mr. Miranda is in that category. And the Brazilian government is extremely concerned at this detention of one of its citizens.
The ruling also came under fire by a number of Muslim human rights NGOs, such as CAGE. Carrie Bullivant, a spokesperson for the group who has also been detained under Schedule 7, said,
"This ruling, although disappointing, is only the lowest court. We hope that as this reaches the higher court, judges will see sense and repeal these draconian measures."
CAGE and other human rights groups are demanding the scrapping of Schedule 7 counter-terrorism measures, which allow to hold a terrorism suspect for up to 9 hours without any evidence. Parliament is seeking to review Schedule 7 measures to make them fairer. However, with concerns about domestic and international terrorism still high on the agenda, security experts still argue that Schedule 7 remains crucial to public safety. Flaminia Jambalvo, Islam Channel.
Well, Omar Farouk, let me begin with you, if I may. I mean, what precedent does this ruling set for press freedom in general in Britain?
Well, I think, as Mr. Vaz said, that terrorism legislation being used in this way against journalists, it does set a very dangerous precedent. We are the mother of democracy in this country, and we claim to be. And we claim to uphold people's human rights, and we actually celebrate investigative journalism, and we lecture other countries, whether it's Uganda, Zimbabwe, or wherever else, where journalists are assaulted, are hassled. For example, we have 3 Al Jazeera journalists today being held by the Egyptian government in prison. So what does it say about our own standing, our principles and our values when we are using terrorism legislation against individuals such as journalists who actually do not fall into the category of terrorism in this manner, in this way? I think it sets a very dangerous precedent. I think it actually does immense harm to the image and standing of our great nation and country.
Well, Porrick Reedy from Index on Censorship, can you hear us? What is your view on whether this is a precedent?
I should hope it's not a precedent, certainly. I mean, David Miranda's legal team do wish to appeal, and I would hope that they're broadly supported in that. There is a worry, it must be said, that this is something, as your previous guest noted, is something that comes across increasingly because terror laws are so vaguely drafted in some ways that these laws can be abused very, very easily. But when Index and Censorship intervened in the case, along with The Independent and the Daily Mirror and the National Union of Journalists, we said very clearly that what you are risking here is reclassifying journalists as being engaged in terrorist activity merely by holding information that the government does not want them to hold. Now, most good journalism is about finding out things that people don't want you to know. So to that extent, any kind of story on security services, on national security, is going to involve getting hold of documents, of files that the government would prefer not to have. So if that's going to be classified as terrorism, then we really are in trouble.
Well, Julian Richards, I mean, do you think that the security services went too far in this case in asking for Miranda to be detained at Heathrow?
No, I don't. I mean, the issue at stake was that Miranda was suspected of carrying a very high number of highly classified documents, the disclosure of which could have caused extreme damage to national security. So it was a very high threshold that was applied, and the state felt it needed to have a look at those documents to see what the level of damage could have been. So these are laws that are used very sparingly. I don't accept the argument that they're very easily applied and are used very sweepingly. Experience shows that they're not. And this particular case seems to have met the appropriate criteria.
Well, damage to national security is not the same as terrorism, isn't it?
Well, terrorism is the highest threat we face to our national security at the moment. And it was felt that within those highly classified documents was the potential for extreme damage to be done to our fight against terrorism. So it wasn't necessarily saying that Miranda is himself a terrorist. It was saying that the material that he was holding could have been of very material value to terrorists who do pose a very high risk to our national security at the moment.
Well, I mean, I've seen the documents that MI5 put to the court because they were released in the court hearings. And MI5 says, we assess that Miranda is knowingly carrying material, the release of which would endanger people's lives. Additionally, the disclosure or threat of the disclosure is designed to influence a government and is made for the purpose of promoting a political or ideological cause. This, therefore, falls within the definition of terrorism. I mean, Bill Bowring, this is implying that any whistleblower who's trying to change government policy in any direction is a terrorist, isn't it?
This is the problem with the definition in the Terrorism Act 2000, that it covers any kind of political activity, as a matter of fact, can be classified as terrorism. And we in this country get very angry with Russia for introducing very, very similar legislation, where anyone critical of the government can be found guilty of extremism or of terrorism. So, I mean, Dr. Richards, if he's right about the reasoning of the court, what he's indicating is that there will surely be a successful appeal in this case.
Well, Porrick Reedy, you're going to appeal it, I take it, are you, for... Oh, I'm sorry, I understand that Porrick Reedy has had to leave. Let me put that point to you. Do you think that an appeal might be successful, or is it...
Well, I think it is definitely a must. I mean, we have to wait and see if it's successful or not. But the reality is that this argument that this really happens is not true. It happens far too often. the whole thing is that we've been arguing that the Schedule 7 is being systematically used for intelligence gathering, but it was never meant to be. And it's been used for that purpose day in, day out. And there are other powers that could have been used. I'm very concerned that the power of terrorism was used in this way. And that actually legitimizes hundreds and thousands of other people being stopped and kept up to 9 hours, which is outrageous, because whatever he was carrying or not could have been obtained and taken away from him in a matter of within 1 hour. To keep him for 9 hours and using this overwhelming power, it's again abuse of the system. And we're seeing this happening day in, day out. It's not an exception.
Well, Farouk, I mean, is that legitimate to say that if the documents fell into the wrong hands, which is another of the MI5 arguments, then that could damage national security? Because even if Miranda himself might be a nice person, there are lots of nasty people out there who could get hold of this stuff.
I mean, John, I'm grateful that you read the port circulation sheet and what the intelligence services had presented to the court. And it actually talks about Miranda knowingly carrying material which, is designed to influence a government and the purpose of promoting by Miranda himself a political or ideological cause. That is not what the man was doing. And the issue is, in terms of stretching the legislation and using powers to gather intelligence, this is not what this legislation is meant to do. The purpose of this legislation is to stop terrorism and to protect our national security, but damage to the image of our nation and so forth somehow, or damage even to our national standing or security, doesn't fall into terrorism. So I find it very difficult when we are extending our legislation and going behind the intent and really trying very hard to fit something into the legislation, the purpose of which the legislation was not meant to do. So the purpose of this legislation is to prevent terrorism. It is not to gather intelligence, and it is not actually to second guess that some information that a person may hold may fall into somebody else's hands. And in fact, all of this information is out there. Mr. Snowden has let it out there, and there are people against Mr. Snowden and people against him. But at the end of the day, eavesdropping on the German Chancellor, I don't think is a way of doing things correctly according to whatever legislation one may have in place. So I think we are actually really going, beyond the red line and really going into the murky waters where things are ambiguous and it is not clear what the government is doing.
Well, let's put that point to Dr. Julian Richards. We would never have known, and Angela Merkel would never have known that her phone was being tapped if it hadn't been for Edward Snowden's disclosures. So, I mean, hasn't there been a benefit from that disclosure? Because now the Americans say they will no longer tap foreign leaders' phones, at least particularly allies.
Well, I mean, that is, of course, a slightly different issue. I mean, it's different from the material that David Miranda was carrying and the grounds on which he was stopped. The question of whether we should monitor the communications of European allies and leaders is another question in a sense. And as you say, there are questions to be asked there. I'm not entirely unsympathetic to the view that, is this the right thing to be doing? But it's a completely different issue from the Miranda case that we were discussing just now.
Well, not entirely, because he was carrying material from Edward Snowden, and I don't know what exactly was in his hard drive, but it might well have been the stuff about Angela Merkel, so it was relevant.
It might have been, but that's obviously that would have no bearing on a terrorist threat in that sense. So there was probably, there was almost certainly all sorts of material in there, but the reason that he was detained and the particular Schedule 7 Act was applied was specifically to do with threats to national security.
But what do you think of the fact that there is no need for the intelligence services to have any suspicion? They can just stop people on a whim almost. I mean, they don't seem to have to produce a reason at all.
Well, they have to. I mean, a lot of this is about proportionality. If you look at the High Court discussion about this particular case in the appeal, this word proportionality comes up a lot. And of course, proportionality is very difficult to measure clearly. It's a weighing of the risk and the benefit and so on. And I do think that the sheer volume of material he had, the very high classification of it, the operational detail in it, meant that I think it was proportionate. And in fact, the High Court has ruled it was proportionate for them to use this particular power. It is a strong power, but it's designed to protect our national security.
Well, thank you. Masood, do you think it was proportional?
No, and I'm actually quite concerned because, first of all, this wasn't the only copy. So it's not the case that, by stopping and behaving that way, you deny him or his partner to actually have access to them. The reality is that this was just a ploy to actually intimidate, because they did have other copies of it. And this is very clear. But also, I think, what is intelligent, what isn't intelligent, could be very difficult thing to define. I remember once an intelligence officer told me that even a telephone book is something that is intelligent and used for intelligent purposes. So that will really leave the way completely open for any of us to be stopped for anything, because it's got some relation to intelligence.
Well, Bill Barron, what's your view on the proportionality thing?
Well, I think we have to go back to the actual words in Schedule 7, which are very clear. And it says that a person can be detained if he or she appears to be a person who is or has been concerned in the commission, preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism. That is the power. It can't possibly apply to Miranda. And for the point that's already been made, that the information is already out there because Snowden already took it. So it's there, in any case, in various forms. And there seems to be a deeper background to this, which is a general attack on the Guardian newspaper, which we've heard from the heads of the security services. And, of course, we know that at about the same time, the authorities went in and smashed up the computers in the basement of the Guardian, notwithstanding the fact that the information there was already out there and in other places at the same time.
Well, we'll come back to that, because the first half of the show we're coming to the end. In this section, we've been discussing the delicate balance between national security and press freedom in light of the recent ruling on the David Miranda case by the High Court. So please rejoin us in the second half of the show, where we'll be discussing the use of the anti-terrorism measures under Schedule 7 on a whole range of cases, not just the David Miranda one.